It began with the red moon, not just a trick of the sky, not some distant celestial anomaly, but a swollen wound that hung low above Milford's sloping hills, bleeding its unnatural light across the thatched rooftops and dew-wet fields like a bad omen no one dared name aloud. The villagers noticed, of course. They paused in their routines, stared upward in uneasy clusters at the edge of the commons, clutching shawls tighter. Children held to hips with soft murmurs. The church bell rang once, not by the sexton's hand, but by some shift in the wind that carried the iron clapper against its rusting cradle. It was a night meant for silence, for staying in, for locking shutters even if the air was warm and still. It was not the kind of night one went into labor. But that was the hour Alira had been called from sleep, her hands still raw from grinding barley, eyes crusted from a restless doze by the hearth. The knock at the midwife's cottage door had been frantic, and she was already lacing her boots by the time the midwife herself woke, groaning from her cot, demanding to know who needed birthing so close to the barley moon. The answer had not come in words, but in a letter thrust into her hands by a cloaked man on a steaming horse, one she barely had time to scan, before being ordered to bring only her apprentice, not the midwife herself. Just Alira, alone. That in itself was strange. Alira was 16, maybe 17, though she'd stopped marking her name days after her mother died. Too young, most said, to carry the full work of a birth alone. Yet the letter bore the sigil of Milford's highest house, the rose and raven seal of Lord Ashvale, and so the midwife, though she muttered curses and warnings, bid Alira to obey. She was dressed in minutes, gathering the linen satchel of oils and herbs, slipping a bit of blessed salt into her apron pocket, as she always did when the moon felt wrong. The rider said nothing on the way, and Alira knew better than to speak. They moved swiftly through the damp woods outside Milford's edge, where trees whispered too close and the sky seemed lower than it had ever been, the red moon peering between branches like a lidless eye. The manor loomed quiet upon the hill. No torches lit its windows. No dogs barked. Only the creak of the saddle and the whisper of her boots against stone told Alira she was still real, still living, not caught in some old spell or story. The man led her through a servant's door and up a stairwell, so narrow it felt more like a tunnel. At the top, a chamber thick with heat and shadow, and a woman's gasp spilling out like broken prayers. Alira stepped into the room and smelled copper before she saw it. Blood, thick and fresh, and not yet clotted. There were women beside the bed, all silent, their faces white as milk, but no one moved. No one helped, only watched. And on the bed, the Baroness. She was younger than Alira expected, barely past 20, her skin already slick with sweat and too pale beneath the candlelight. Her eyes fluttered open as Alira approached, and for a moment they locked, not in fear, not in pleading, but in something deeper, something terrible, as if she'd been waiting for Alira, not the other way around. Too early, one of the chambermaids whispered, though to whom she spoke, Alira could not say. The Baroness cried out then, her body arching, and the room fractured into motion. Alira did what she had been taught. Hot water, steady hands, firm voice. She whispered the sacred lines for easing pain, pressed a palm root poultice against the Baroness's back, ignored the way the other women flinched when she spoke aloud. The child came fast, too fast, a storm through canal, and Alira caught him in both hands before he fell. He did not cry at first. He only blinked once, twice, and when he did, Alira's breath caught. His eyes, not blue, not hazel, not the green of the Ashvale line. Silver, pale as glass, rimmed with smoke. The eyes of the northern blood, the blood that was supposed to have died out in the mountain wars, the blood that made lords tremble. And as she stared at him, Alira understood. The Baroness reached for her, weak and trembling, and whispered something so faint it could have been wind. Keep him safe. Then her hand dropped. Her chest fell still. The room froze again, but now there was fear in the air, sharp and flammable. One of the chambermaids began to wail, not from sorrow, but from panic. Another pulled the drapes shut. The cloaked man from before reappeared, spoke low to someone Alira couldn't see. There was movement, fast and purposeful, and then one of the women reached for the child in Alira's arms. She stepped back. No, she said. They stared at her. "He's not yours," she said. Her voice shook, but her arms didn't. "You know he's not." The man moved toward her, slow, like approaching a wounded dog. "Give him to me, girl." Alira turned and ran. She didn't think. There was no plan, only instinct and fear and the unbearable clarity that what had happened in that room would be buried by morning, the child's truth sewn shut with the Baroness's final breath. She fled to the servants' passages, down stone corridors, slipping through storerooms and past silent cooks with flour on their faces, their eyes averted. No one stopped her. No one asked. Out the back gate, through the garden, into the orchard. The child was warm against her chest, his breathing shallow, his hands curled into fists like little questions. By the time she reached the edge of Milford, dawn was still hours off, and her shift clung to her body with sweat and birth blood. She didn't try to hide. She just kept walking, out past the last house, toward the old fence line where the woods began again, toward the hills that led to the world beyond. They found her at the gate. Not the cloak man, not the midwife, the magistrate's men, pale-faced and armored with law. One of them held a torch. The other held rope. She didn't run. She stood still, the baby still against her chest, now sleeping. When they asked what she had done, she said nothing. When they accused her of theft, of madness, of witchery, she said nothing. When they pried the child from her arms and handed him to a matron in mourning black, she screamed. Not loud, but long. And it tore through the orchard like a wounded bird. They did not jail her. That would imply she had rights to be tried. Instead, the council met behind closed doors, and by dusk, the town crier read her fate from the steps of the grain hall. Alira, apprentice of midwifery, is hereby declared unfit for fellowship, guilty of unlawful abduction and refusal of order. She shall be cast beyond the boundary and forbidden return upon pain of death. No one wept for her, but a few turned their eyes away. The next morning, just before first light, Alira was led to the pass. The guards gave her a sack with a heel of bread, a tin of water, and her own cloak, still damp from the night she fled. She walked barefoot, by choice. Each stone was a reminder, each cut a vow. She did not look back. But as she crossed the last ridge, where the town dipped out of sight and only the wide world stretched before her, she touched the locket that hung against her skin, the one she'd taken from a midwife's shelf in the moment before the horseman arrived. It held no image, no name, just a bit of braided hair and a scrap of red silk, torn from the swaddling cloth the child had worn. It was not much, but it was enough to remember. And Alira, who had been cast out as a thief, knew she carried something more precious than any gold they could have paid her to stay silent. She carried the truth, and it was not done with her yet. The snow came early that year, sweeping over the hills like a hush across the world, burying cart tracks and boundary stones beneath a silence so deep it felt sacred. Alira walked into it without looking back, her boots long ruined, her cloak stiff with frozen sweat. The path beyond the mountain pass was no road at all, just a narrowing suggestion of a trail carved by hooves, an old instinct, curling between skeletal birch trees and thorny underbrush that tore at her skirts like the hands of the world trying to pull her back. But there was nothing behind her now. Milford had swallowed her name like a stone dropped in a well. No word would come from that place again, and none would be welcome. In the far country, exile was not a name spoken aloud. It was a weight a person carried silently, like frost on the lungs or blood in the boot soles. The baby was gone. Her arms still ached from holding him, the memory of his warmth like phantom pain. At night, when the wind moved through the woods in low moans and the branches creaked overhead, she imagined the shape of him still pressed against her chest, his breath making small fogs against her skin. But he was miles behind her now, wrapped in silk and secrecy, nestled in a cradle that did not belong to him, tended by hands that knew nothing of the Baroness's final whisper. Alira told herself he would survive. He had to. It was the only thought that kept her moving when her feet blistered and bled, when the cold turned her fingers white and senseless, when hunger made the edges of the world blur and sharpen by turns. She slept where she could, beneath overhangs of rock, inside hollow tree trunks, under makeshift lean-tos built from saplings and her own numb resolve. Once, She found a half-buried barn at the edge of a deserted field, the roof long since collapsed, but the stone hearth still standing. She made fire there and stayed for 2 nights. Too weak to go on, feeding the flames with pages torn from the herbs book she'd stolen from a midwife's shelf. It had been her lifeline in the first days, a slim leather-bound volume of roots and tinctures, but survival made cruel barter, and fire was more urgent than knowledge. She kept the front page, though, the one with the faded illustration of the blue yarrow flower, the midwife's initials scrawled beneath in a hand firm and neat. She folded it into the lining of her cloak, near the locket. Some things were not for burning. On the 12th day, the snow deepened into drifts so high she could not see the path. Her legs moved by rote, like some stubborn, primitive rhythm left over from birth, from hunger, from the knowledge that life was not given, only stolen back from the edge again and again. It was then she saw the hut. At first, she thought it a trick of the white light, a shadow born of exhaustion. But as she staggered forward, the shape resolved, a small stone structure, half buried by snow, smoke trailing faintly from a chimney that leaned like a drunkard's spine. The door hung crooked on its hinges, and when she knocked, no answer came. She pushed it open and stepped into the dimness, where the air was warmer than it had any right to be. A fire still smoldered in the hearth, faint and orange, and someone had left a wool blanket folded neatly beside it. But there was no one, no footprints, no food, just a silence that felt not abandoned, but paused. Elira collapsed beside the fire without thinking, curling her body into the tightest shape she could manage. The blanket pulled over her shoulders like the arms of a stranger who didn't ask questions. She slept for what might have been a day or 3, waking only to drink melted snow and feed the embers of whatever she could find. Strips of old furniture, dried pine cones, bits of her own journal torn page by page. She spoke aloud sometimes, not to call for help, but to keep her voice tethered to her own ears. She spoke to the fire, to the wind, to the locket, to the boy. She told stories she remembered from her mother, half-formed tales of birds that turned into stars and girls who stole the voices of kings. Her voice was cracked and low, more breath than sound, but it soothed her, made her less ghost. Time lost shape inside the hut. Snowstorms came and went. Days grayed into nights and back again. Once, she thought she saw tracks in snow beyond the window, wolf or dog, hard to say, but they did not come close. Perhaps they knew the hut was claimed by something older than them. She began to put things in order, repaired the door as best she could with a wooden slat and a rusted hinge she found behind the hearth, collected rainwater in a broken copper basin, made traps from string and stones to catch mice, though she hated killing them. Once, she caught nothing for 5 days and ate boiled pine needles just to keep her belly from eating itself. Her body grew thin, her joints stiff, but her mind sharpened with the clarity of those who have nothing left to lose. She wrote again, not in ink, which she had none of, but with charcoal on the walls, long curling lines of truth she could not bear to forget. Names, dates, the Baroness's final hour, the silver eyes, the way the chambermaids had not flinched at death, only at truth. Her own name, again and again like a spell, Elira, Elira, Elira. It was on one of those nights, when the snow had stopped falling and the sky was clear with stars, that she dreamed of the child. He stood at the edge of the woods, dressed in clothes he had never worn, older now, perhaps 7 or 8, hair black as her own, mouth set with the quiet defiance of someone who had always felt the shape of his own difference. He did not speak. He only looked at her with those silver eyes, and in them she saw not accusation, not confusion, but a kind of waiting, a patience that hurt her more than anything else. When she woke, her face was wet, though she had not felt herself crying. She rose before dawn the next day and walked into the woods. Not far, just enough to gather herbs and kindling, to stretch her legs, to remind herself the world was still there. She found frozen roots she could dry, moss that soothed burns, bark with bitter properties that could keep her from starving. She began to keep a basket by the door, wrapped in oilskin. She did not know for whom she was preparing, only that the act of doing so mattered. Sometimes she saw birds that should not have been there, migratory species that had long since passed, and she took them as signs that the path she had taken, though ruined and raw, was not the wrong one, that the world still bent itself subtly around truth. She started carving small things from wood, shapes she remembered from her mother's mantelpiece. A deer, a tree, a mother and child in silhouette. She placed them on the hearth ledge, small guardians of a life not yet finished. On one, the tallest, she carved initials. L.A., not her own, but the child's. Lyra and Ashvale. She had not dared speak his name until that moment, not even to herself. But now she whispered it often, like prayer, like a flare sent into the dark. She told the wind of his birth. She told the fire of his blood. She told the cracked stone walls of his truth. And in the stillness, something inside her settled. Not peace, not yet, but a kind of anchor. She had not failed. Not yet. She had done the thing no one else had dared. She had seen what the world tried to bury, and she had remembered. When spring finally came, it did not announce itself with blooms or birdsong, but with a slow melting of snow from the roof, the soft drip of water into a rusted tin pail outside the door. The trees remained bare for weeks, but the earth began to show its skin again, dark, bruised, stubborn. Elira began to venture further each day, learning the shape of the land around her hut, the way it curved gently toward a valley where a stream ran shallow and clear. Once, she found a ring of stones that could only have been placed by human hands, now grown over with moss and fern. She knelt there and placed one of her carvings in the center, pressing her fingers to the damp ground as if it might remember her. In time, she began to gather herself for the journey back. Not to return, not ask forgiveness, but to recover what she could, a ledger, a name, a thread that still needed pulling. Milford was not far, only a few days' walk through the wooded pass, though it felt a lifetime away. She knew they would not welcome her, but she also knew the midwife's house would be empty, boarded up, forgotten, and in its walls, beneath its floors, something waited. But that would come later. For now, she sat by the hearth, locket in one hand, the herbs book open to its last salvage page in the other, and whispered once more the name she would never let the world erase. Lyra. The truth had not died in exile. It had only taken root. The thaw came slowly that year, reluctant and half-hearted, as though even the sun doubted its place in a world so burdened with silence. Snow receded in uneven patches, revealing soil bruised by winter's long fist, and the woods around the hut gave way to the first signs of uncertain green. Buds, not yet brave enough to open. Birds, cautious and few. Streams that ran sluggish and thick with meltwater. Elira watched the season turn with the wariness of someone who had learned to distrust the promises of renewal. Spring did not bring peace. It brought movement, and movement, in her world, always meant risk. For weeks, she had felt it building, like a knot beneath the ribs, an impulse, not born from restlessness, but necessity. She could not stay hidden forever. What she had seen, what she had known and carried across a frozen exile, did not belong to her alone. Truth had its own hunger, its own memory. It would not remain quiet. Something in her had shifted since the dream of the boy, since the whisper of his name had left her mouth, like a promise made to the stars. She had been entrusted, not by the barrenness alone, but by fate or blood or some sorrowful design older than language. And now the season had changed. It was time. She began to prepare with care and silence, not as one who hoped to return, but as one who knew the cost of doing so. Her movements were slow and deliberate. She packed food into a satchel stitched from old cloth and softened leather, lined the bottom with the last of the dried roots, a few crumbled strips of cured rabbit, and several clean bandages she had sewn over winter from scraps of her own petticoat. Into a smaller pouch she placed a locket, the carved figure of the mother and child, and a bit of dried sage tied with twine. The last page of the herbs book, now stiff and stained with soot, she folded and pressed between layers of cloth at the top. Next, the short knife she always carried at her belt. She dressed in her warmest layers, patched and uneven, but strong. She braided her hair tight and low, the way her mother had once done before funerals and storm crossings, and left a small scrap of blue thread knotted around one wrist. Protection, she whispered, or memory. When she set out at dawn, the sky was pale and wide, the wind high in the trees, but gentle at her back. She did not look back at the hut. She knew what it had given her. Shelter, silence, solitude enough to become someone new, but it could not give her what came next. She followed the trail east, winding through soft hills and fir-covered slopes that gradually leveled into flatter terrain of Milford's outskirts. Her path was not direct. She knew the roads would be watched, even after all this time. Some names were never truly forgotten, only pushed aside for fear of what they might stir. She moved instead to the hidden places, the gaps between fences, the dry beds of old rivers, the fallen trails of hunters long gone. She walked at night when she could, and slept during the day beneath thorn bushes or beneath the low-hanging boughs of cedar trees. Her dreams were full of the baby's eyes again, silver, sharp, unnatural in their beauty, not demonic, as some might have said, not cursed, just true, too true. By the fourth day, she had drawn near enough to see the old steeple of the Milford Chapel rising above the hills like a finger pointing skyward, still darkened at its edges from the lightning strike years ago. Her feet ached with every step. Her ribs were sore from the weight of the satchel against her side, but her mind had grown sharper with every mile, narrowing into purpose. The midwife's cottage lay on the northern edge of the village, far enough from the center to avoid the eyes of those who still lingered in the taverns and trade halls. It had once been a place of warmth, its porch cluttered with drying herbs and chipped porcelain bowls, its windows steamed from a boil of water and tea, its walls humming with the soft sounds of laboring mothers and whispered prayers. Now it stood silent and shuttered, a gray husk of what had been, its front garden overrun with nettles and creeping ivy. Elira waited until nightfall to approach. The streets were mostly empty by then, save for a few drunkards stumbling home and a constable making his slow circuit near the green. She wore her hood low and kept the shadows, her steps measured, her breath shallow. The back window had never latched properly, and it still gave way beneath her hand with a faint creak. Inside, the air was stale, layered with dust and the faint odor of long-decayed herbs. She stepped carefully, avoiding the floorboard she remembered as weak or loud, and paused only once, beside the old stove where the midwife had once taught her to steep chamomile for restless mothers. A cracked teacup still rested on the table nearby, as if waiting. The ledger was not hard to find. She had known where it would be, the loose board beneath the bed, beneath a false bottom layered with cloth. Her hands trembled as she pulled it free, not from fear, but from the flood of memory it carried. The leather cover was soft and worn, the spine repaired with waxed thread. Inside, the pages were lined with careful ink entries, each one a story in miniature. Mother's name, date of birth, weight of child, complications, lineage. Most of the entries were plain, anonymous, marked by time and repetition. But she turned to the page she had memorized in exile, the one she had seen only once, but could never forget. The date matched the night of the red moon. There, written in the midwife's hand, was the name of the Baroness, Lady Irina Ashvale, delivered of a male child, still breathing. Complications noted, excessive blood loss. And beneath that, scrawled more hastily, as though added in fear or haste, another name, not noble, not titled. The ink was faded, and the name had been crossed through, but not enough to hide it fully. Elira could still read the letters beneath. Lita Thorne, the handmaid, the sister's companion, a girl no one spoke of in noble circles, but whom Elira remembered from glimpses around the manor, quiet, slight, always watching. There had been whispers, once, that the Baroness had taken her in after a scandal in the southern provinces, that she had no family left, that she was fiercely loyal. But Elira now understood the truth those whispers had hidden. It had not been the Baroness who had carried that child in her womb. It had been Lita, hidden, protected, disguised beneath the veil of privilege. And when the child came, it was Lady Ashvale who bore the pain, who bore the silence, and who died carrying the burden of someone else's shame. Elira sat down hard on the edge of the bed, the ledger open in her lap. Her hands were shaking now, fully and without disguise. She traced a name with one finger, as though by touching it she could draw the ghost of the woman into the room with her. Lita Thorne, the true mother, The one whose name would never be known, whose child would grow up believing himself born of polished marble and silk, when his roots were tangled in something far humbler, far more human. Alira felt something harden in her then, not anger exactly, but conviction, a tightening of the heart around the core of what she now carried. Proof, not enough to change the world, but enough to make it look at itself again. She tore the page from the ledger carefully, folded it between two layers of linen, and slipped it into her satchel. She took nothing else. Not the herbs, not the teacup, not the memory of her own childhood cot in the corner. When she left, it was through the front door, boldly, quietly, as one who had nothing left to fear. She made it as far as the edge of the village before the bell rang. Not the chapel bell this time, the town's warning bell. A single peal, low and long. Alira ducked into the hedgerow and waited, breath caught in her throat. A moment later, she heard voices. Two men, arguing low. Something about a theft. Something about a girl. They had noticed. She moved faster after that, keeping to the tree lean, her footsteps soft and light with adrenaline. By the time the sky began to pale at the edges, she had crossed the old stone bridge and left Milford behind. Again, but this time not empty-handed. She walked until her legs gave out, then crawled beneath the roots of a great oak and held the page to her chest as the morning light filtered through the canopy above. She did not sleep, not that night. Her eyes stayed open, watching the slow movement of the branches, the way they swayed without hurry, as if time itself were cradled in their limbs. The truth was hers now, and this time it would not be buried. The road to Thornmere was no more than a suggestion carved through hills and hedgerows, a footpath softened by generations of weather and neglect, worn by the passage of hooves and wheels and women who had walked its length carrying burdens too sacred or too shameful to name aloud. Alira walked it with sore feet and aching shoulders, the ledger page pressed flat against her chest beneath the layers of cloth, its presence like a second heartbeat. The journey took days, and though she moved with caution, she did not skulk as she had before. Something had changed. With the page in her possession, she no longer felt like a fugitive. She felt like a bearer, a keeper of something necessary and unfinished. The truth was no longer a weight she dragged behind her. It had become a thread she followed, pulled taut through the wilderness of silence and erasure, and somewhere ahead, she knew, it would lead her to someone who would listen. Thornmere sat low in the land, cradled by the bend of two slow-moving rivers, and surrounded by marshy fields that breathed mist at dawn and dusk. It was not a place of industry or pride. The houses were squat, made of wattle and daub, patched with whatever the wind hadn't yet taken. Fences leaned like old men in prayer. Chickens roamed freely, scattering at the sound of unfamiliar boots. No banners flew, no bells rang. It was the kind of place that asked no questions, not because it was kind, but because it had learned the danger of answers. Alira arrived near sunset. The sky lit in streaks of gold and bruised plum, her body sore from the long descent. She stopped on the road's edge and watched the village for a time, measuring its silences. The way smoke curled lazily from a few chimneys, the faint clatter of pails at a well. It looked like every place she had passed through, and none of them all at once. There was something quiet in it, not the silence of neglect or indifference, but the silence of people who had survived something together. It reminded her of the stories her mother had told about storm-wrecked towns and famine-withered parishes that had learned to cling to each other like driftwood. She made her way down the main lane and was almost past the tanner's house when she heard the voice. "You're limping, girl." Alira turned, slowly, wary but not yet alarmed. The voice belonged to a woman in a soot-stained apron, leaning in the doorway of a narrow, smoke-scarred cottage. Her arms were bare, strong, and freckled, her hair bound back with a strip of cloth. She looked not kind, but capable, the kind of person who noticed things because she had learned that noticing meant the difference between living and not. "Long walk," Alira answered simply. The woman studied her a moment longer, then jerked her chin toward the doorway. "Coming before the frost does." Alira hesitated only briefly. Something in her, the same instinct that had led her from Milford and through the snowbound wilderness, told her this was not danger. Not yet. She crossed the threshold and was met by the dense scent of leather, lye, and smoke. The cottage was simple, One room, a table near the hearth, a cot along the far wall, shelves cluttered with tools and jars of wax, and stretched hides drying from the rafters. It was not warm, but it was shelter. The woman motioned to a stool. Name's Marla, Tanner's widow. I keep to myself and don't take in strays. But you don't smell like wine or war, and you're not asking for anything. So I figure I'll feed you a bowl and see what tomorrow brings. Elira nodded once, and Saturday, thank you. They did not speak much as Marla stirred a pot of thick barley stew and ladled it into 2 chip bowls. Elira ate slowly, the warmth of the food opening her chest like a thaw. When she finished, she reached for her satchel and withdrew a scrap of linen stitched with herbs. She handed it to Marla. For your hands, she said. The lies split them. Marla took the bundle and examined it in silence. Then she grunted. Healer? Midwife's apprentice. Once. Marla nodded again, this time more slowly. Then I won't ask where you came from. And she didn't. Not that night, nor the next, nor the week after that. Elira stayed on. First in exchange for sweeping the floors and fetching water, then for mending clothes and stitching boots, and finally for tending the wounds that always found way into the lives of the poor. Burns, cuts, chilblains, old breaks that ached when the wind shifted. Marla didn't ask about the ledger page or the locket or the way Elira woke some nights with her mouth pressed to her palm to keep from crying aloud. But she noticed. That much was clear in the way she made space, in the way she never asked if Elira would leave. She simply made room, as though she already knew that no one who arrived in Thornmere did so by accident. Seasons turned in the way only small places noticed, subtle shifts in light, the return of one kind of bird and the departure of another, the changing texture of the earth beneath the boots of those who walked it daily. In time, Elira became a fixture. The villagers began to call her the girl with the quiet eyes, or the one who knows the poultices. Children watched her with a mix of awe and caution. Men lowered their voices when she passed. She did not speak of Milford or the Baroness, or the silver-eyed child who had been torn from her arms, but she carried him in everything. In the way she rocked babies born to the laborers' wives, in the way she paused when a boy asked her about the stars, in the way she whispered his name, Lyran, into the wind each night as though the world might carry it back to him. One morning, near the end of summer, she saw him, not close, not clearly, just a glimpse, riding to the bend at the far edge of Thornmere, seated in a high, dark carriage drawn by 2 sleek mares. The emblem on the side bore the rose and raven crest. Ashvale, the blood she had protected, the lie that had become legacy. The boy was older now, perhaps 5 or 6, his hair neatly combed, his shoulders held too stiff for one so young. But when the carriage slowed at the curve of the road, he turned his head, and for one brief, breathless moment, their eyes met. Even from a distance, she knew. The silver had not dulled. He did not wave, did not smile, but his gaze lingered too long for a stranger. His head tilted just slightly, as though hearing something faint but familiar. Then the carriage moved on. Elira stood frozen in the doorway of Marla's cottage for a long while, her hands trembling, her heart pacing itself in a rhythm she had not felt in years. When she stepped back inside, Marla was watching her from the table, a piece of leather half sewn in her lap. You saw something, she said. Elira sat slowly, still staring at the door. Someone. Marla didn't press. Instead, she rose and poured them both tea. They sat in silence as the steam curled between them. The world outside quiet with the heat of noon, and the slow breathing of a village that had learned to live in the gaps between what was known and what was carried. That night, Elira removed the ledger page from its hiding place beneath the floorboard and read it again, not because she had forgotten, but because seeing the truth in her own hand anchored her. She added a note in the margin, just a word. Seen. Then she folded it again and placed it back into its cloth sheath. She knew now that he was not lost. He was watching, and he remembered. The road ahead had not yet revealed itself, but the path beneath her feet was no longer empty. It was lined with threads of blood, of memory, of names that had not yet been spoken but still lived in the quiet, in the pause before the wind shifted. And Elira, midwife's orphan in exile, now understood the weight of what she had been given. not just a child, but a bloodline, not just a secret, but a beginning. The summer burned dry, and strange the year Thornmere fell. Even the birds seemed to sing less, as if they too sensed the heaviness in the wind that swept across the marshes and over the low thatch roofs, curling into the spaces between silence and suspicion. The days were long, but offered little peace. The crops grew tall but brittle, too fast and too thirsty, as though trying to outrun some shadow neither sky nor soil could explain. The air hung thick with heat and dust and the scent of earth cracking open. People grew quiet. Tempers flared over spilled milk and bent nails. The well dried 2 weeks early, and children fetched water in smaller buckets. Men smoked without speaking. Women kept their hands busy, but their eyes on the horizon. It was not one thing that changed the rhythm of Thornmere, but a series of barely audible notes, accumulating like an old song none dared sing aloud. Alira felt it in her bones first. Not fear, but the tension that precedes it. A quiet hum beneath the skin, a restlessness in the marrow that had nothing to do with movement and everything to do with knowing. She began waking before dawn without cause, her breath caught in her throat, her hands already clenched as if bracing for a blow. She double-checked the lock on the satchel where the ledger page and the locket still lay hidden. She made extra poultices and lined them in jars beneath the floorboards. She rationed their food, though no one yet spoke of scarcity. She watched the road more often, listened harder to the silence between conversations. And always, in the hollow of her chest, there was a sense that she had wandered too close again, that her name had stirred the wrong shadow. That memory, once buried, had begun to claw its way back to the surface, dragging a trail of truth behind it like a wounded animal seeking home. Marla noticed too. She did not speak it, not aloud, but her movements became sharper, more efficient, her gaze slower in its sweeps of the street, her voice lower when she spoke to the other villagers. She took to placing a hammer beside her door at night, and she cleaned her old hunting blade without explanation. It was not paranoia. It was preparation. Thornmere had survived before, but survival demanded anticipation. It demanded the willingness to accept what others refused to see. And what both Marla and Alira knew, in the wordless language of women who had endured loss and still walked upright, was that change had already begun. It was simply choosing its moment to strike. It came, in the end, not with warning, but with the rattle of hooves on hard-packed dirt, the glint of metal in the midday sun, the sharp bark of orders that did not belong to this village's tongue. Soldiers, not local, not even provincial, but bearing the markings of distant authority, emblems Alira did not recognize, stitched in scarlet and gray. They arrived in a small company, 10 or 12 in all, faces flushed from heat, tempers high from the long ride. They dismounted in the square without preamble, drinking from their own flasks, ignoring the stares of the children who peeked from behind fences. Their captain, a man with a crooked nose and a voice like broken gravel, read a decree from a scroll none of the villagers could follow. Something about rebel sympathizers, about harboring fugitives, about the right to search, to seize, to burn. The villagers protested, but meekly. Too much had already been lost in the past decades for this town to believe it still had the right to defiance. Alira stood in the doorway beside Marla, her pulse steady, her breath deep and even. She knew what was coming, though not the shape it would take. The captain's eyes swept the crowd with the practiced disinterest of a man used to violence, used to suspicion, used to knowing that guilt could be invented when none presented itself. When his eyes passed over Alira, they paused. Just briefly, but long enough. The searches began that night. Soldiers tore through homes like dogs through brush, careless and brutal. They overturned tables, split open mattresses, shattered dishes without reason or remorse. When they found nothing, they accused. When accusations rang hollow, they threatened. The people of Thornmere endured it in silence, but the silence was brittle. A few resisted. A boy struck a soldier with a stick and was left bloodied in the mud. An old man cursed their captain and was dragged into the churchyard and whipped before the altar. No one helped. No one could. Fear was not a storm in Thornmere. It was a frost, creeping low and quiet until everything cracked beneath it. Alira hid the ledger page in the wall. Behind a stone she had loosened months before in case of such a need. The locket she wore again, beneath her dress, close to her skin, at night. She lay beside Marla in a cramped bed and listened to the sound of boots passing in the dark, of horses restless in the square, of something ancient and cruel rising to the timbers of the village like smoke from a forgotten fire. And then the fire came. It began in the eastern quarter, near the river bend where the thatch was driest and the cottages closest. No one saw who struck the match, and no one claimed the blame. Perhaps it had been an accident. Perhaps not. But the flames moved quickly, devouring roofs and climbing walls, leaping from one home to the next with hungry, ecstatic joy. The villagers screamed, gathered buckets, tried to form lines, but the soldiers only watched. Some laughed. Some leaned on their spears as if at a harvest bonfire. One of them poured oil at the base of a door. Another drew a blade and carved a symbol into a barn's frame as the fire climbed behind him. This was not justice. It was cleansing. It was a warning dressed in flame. Marla's cottage went last. Elira had already packed what she could. She had known. The moment the first smoke curled into the sky, she had moved without speaking. The ledger page, the locket, the poultices, her mother's thread. She did not weep. She did not tremble. She did not look behind her until Marla gripped her shoulder and turned her. "You have to run," the older woman said. Her voice was low, firm, already rough with smoke. "You have to go now. You know that." "I can help," Elira said, though she did not believe it. "Not truly. You help by living," Marla said. "You help by remembering, by telling what they did here." There was no time for farewell. The roof had already begun to sag. Elira ran. She took the north path out of Thornmere, the one that led into the shallow hills and to the pine wood beyond. The fire lit the sky behind her, turning the dusk blood orange and gold. Smoke followed her like a second shadow. She did not know who had survived. She did not know if Marla had. But in her pocket was something small and metal, something she had found weeks before in a drawer beside Marla's bed and had carried since. A locket, scorched around the edges. Inside, a curled lock of black hair and a tiny ribbon, pale green with age. Not hers, not Marla's. A son's, perhaps. A brother's. Someone lost, years ago, to war or work or punishment. Marla had never spoken of him, but she had kept the locket in the drawer closest to her sleeping body. That was enough. Elira buried it beneath a maple tree 2 miles outside the village. She marked the grave with a small circle of stones and whispered no prayer, only the name she imagined he had carried. Then she kept walking. By dawn, she had reached the stream and crossed it, the ledger page still dry in its wrapping, the locket still against her skin. She had nothing else now. No village, no companion, no fire to sleep beside. But she had something else. Something deeper. She had proof. She had grief. And she had the names of the dead, now added to the list she carried in her mind like a litany. Irina, Lita, Marla, Thornmere. One by one, their names would be spoken. One by one, their truths would be remembered. The road ahead was long. But Elira no longer walked with silence. She walked with memory. The lake of quiet reeds lay tucked beyond the reach of the old trade roads, its waters long forgotten by merchants and nobility, charted only in the memories of pilgrims, widows, and women who no longer wished to be found. It was not a place one stumbled upon. To reach it required silence, intention, and some measure of grief. The path wound through heathered hills and narrow woodlands, flanked by cattails and crowberries, until the land fell away in a hush and the reeds appeared, tall and unmoving, parting only slightly to reveal a stillness, so complete it could not be born of nature alone. The lake held no reflection. Not really. What it gave back was not the image of the self, but the shadow of it, the echo of what one had chosen to leave behind. And when Elira arrived, her boots torn, her hands blistered, her soul hollowed by fire and flight, she felt it take her without judgment. The cloister stood at the lake's edge, built of pale stone and low eaves, its chapel roof weathered by wind, its garden lined with herbs and slates bearing no names. The sisters called themselves the daughters of the ash and reed. They did not wear veils or rings, nor did they ask for vows in blood or ink. Their rituals were simple. They rose with the sun, They worked with the soil. They spoke only when the world called for it. Their silence was not punitive. It was not the silence of shame or suppression. It was a silence of listening, of deep and deliberate attention, of yielding space for memory to root and reshape. They had taken in orphans, madwomen, midwives accused of crimes their own hands had never committed. They had taken in widows who had buried children and refused to remarry, and soldiers' wives who woke each night screaming. They took Alira, too, though she offered no name and gave no account of what she had fled. They did not need it. They saw the smoke in her hair, the hollowness behind her eyes, the way her fingers curled around the satchel she refused to part with even in sleep. They saw her, and they nodded, and one of them, an elder with a face like birch bark and a voice like linen drawn through water, simply said, "You may be Sister Ash, if you wish." Alira accepted without a word. She was given a cell at the far end of the cloister, near the garden wall, where lavender grew high against a stone and bees moved through the stalks in soft patterns. The bed was narrow and hard. The blanket made a corset that smelled faintly of smoke and mint. There was a basin for water, a hook for her cloak, a small shelf on which rested a single candle and a worn book of reflections. She did not read it, not for weeks. Her eyes refused the shape of words. Her thoughts came in waves, slow and brackish, like the silted current of the lake. Memories of Thornmere burning, of Marla's voice in the dark, of the boy's silver eyes glancing through the carriage window and disappearing down the bend. She did not weep, not openly, but some nights she woke with her pillow damp and her throat raw from the effort of holding back sound. The sisters said nothing, but they left small offerings outside her door, a sprig of rosemary, a bowl of cool barley, a needle threaded with red silk. She accepted them all. She did not thank them. It was not expected. The rhythm of life in the cloister was not fast, but it was exacting. The sisters rose before first light and moved through their work in near silence, their gestures fluid and certain, as though guided by something older than discipline. Alira was given tasks slowly. First to draw water from a spring-fed well, then to weed the herb garden, then to strip and dry lavender, to press balm leaves, to bottle tinctures in amber jars labeled with hand-carved tags. Eventually, she was asked to join the others in the small infirmary, where the sick from neighboring hill villages came seeking salves and wisdom, not sermons. Here, her hands remembered themselves. She mixed poultices for chilblains and bee stings, measured fever with the back of her wrist, whispered old midwife rhymes beneath her breath as she wrapped bruised ribs and coaxed breath into the lungs of a girl with a cracked collarbone. She never introduced herself. She wore no badge. But when they left, those who had sat beneath her care would often glance back once more, eyes wide, as though trying to place the weight of the calm she had given them. The sisters began to speak to her in fragments, not conversation, but offerings, a proverb left in the margin of a shared prayer book, a question traced into spilled flour on the counter of the baking room, a folded scrap of paper left beneath her pillow. "What name do you carry?" To each, Alira gave no reply, but each word sank into her like a pebble dropped into water, rippling quiet answers she was not yet ready to voice. In her free hours, of which there were few, but sacred, she walked the edge of the lake. She never entered it. No one did. The reeds stood tall and thick, their roots hidden beneath opaque shallows. But she watched the way the breeze moved across their tops like breath, and she listened to birdsong that wove in and out of hush like thread through burlap. One day, she brought the ledger page with her. She sat beneath a willow and unfolded it slowly, smoothing the creases with the back of her hand. She traced the names again: Irina Ashvale, Lita Thorne, Lyren. Each letter remained, untouched by fire or time. The page did not shake in her hands. Her fear had faded into something quieter. Grief, perhaps, or purpose. She folded it again, and instead of hiding it, placed it within the folds of her new prayer book. There was no safer place for truth than beside a name never spoken. It was during her 7th month at the cloister that she was asked to teach. The younger girls, orphans and outcast daughters brought in from the edge of the world, were gathered in the chapel each afternoon to learn their letters. Few could read beyond the words carved above the cloister gate, asterisk and silent seed. In seed, song. Asked her sister Merrill, who had taught the before, had fallen ill, her lungs thin from decades of inhaling boiling lye and candle smoke. Elira was chosen not because she was learned, but because her voice was soft and steady, and because the girls already listened when she spoke. She accepted, unsure, and began by teaching the names of herbs: lavender, rue, juniper, balm. Then parts of the body: hand, breath, blood, womb. They wrote slowly, their script crooked but sincere, and she corrected them gently, never raising her voice. She drew from memory more than book, from the notes she had once made in the margins of her herb manual, from the quiet wisdom of the midwife who had raised her from girlhood. In time, the girls began to ask questions about the body, about loss, about what happened to women who were cast out. She did not lie to them. She did not give them names, but she gave them truths. That pain does not mean shame. That silence can be holy or harmful, and the difference lies in choice. That to carry life, or end it or survive it, does not make a woman more or less worthy. It makes her real. She began to write again. Not letters, those still hurt too much, but passages, observations, prayers of a kind, reflections, etched in charcoal and copied in the back of old ledgers and on the blank pages at the end of forgotten hymnals. She wrote about mothers who died nameless, and those who died remembered, about the power of the womb and the weight of bearing truth, about the cruelty of lineage when it served only silence. And she copied the ledger page by hand, over and over again, until her wrist cramped and her ink ran dry. Each copy she folded in linen and sent with trusted sisters to small scribes she had known before, old men and women who had copied birth records and death notices and parish rolls in the corners of old city libraries. She did not sign them. She did not need to. The truth spoke for itself. Seasons passed. Gelsgrutayer. The air grew colder. Some nights, the lake froze at its edge, and the reeds bowed low under the weight of frost. Elira grew older too, though her face stayed quiet and her back straight. She no longer dreamed of Thornmere, but she dreamed often of a boy walking through reeds, his eyes catching the moonlight like water, his hand outstretched towards something just beyond reach. When she woke, she would light the candle by her bed and whisper, Lyran, not as a hope, but as a tether, a thread that bound her still to the moment when all the world had broken open and she had chosen to carry what others had tried to hide. She did not know if he remembered her, if the dream she had at his gaze meeting hers on the edge of Thornmere was memory or wish. But she believed, not in destiny, not in miracles, in the persistence of blood, in the stubbornness of truth, in the way certain names refused to die. And when the letter came, a plain envelope, sealed with no crest, carried by a stranger who left before she could ask his name. She knew it before she opened it. The handwriting inside was new, young, uncertain in its formality, but the words were unmistakable. I do not know why I remember you, only that I always have. No name signed, but it didn't need one. She placed a letter in the hollow of her prayer book, beside the ledger page, beside the first word she had ever taught to the girls. Blood. Outside, the lake was still, but in her, something had begun to move again. The castle on the western hill was built from stone older than any name still spoken within its halls, its walls patched and rebuilt with each passing generation, each fire, each storm, each marriage of power to silence. It was said the stones remembered even when men chose not to, and that if one pressed their palm to the cold inner columns of the west wing, where the moonlight never reached, they might still feel the heartbeat of old secrets pulsing beneath the mortar. The boy lived there now, though he was no longer quite a boy. Lyran, heir by title but not by blood, carried the air of someone both belonging and estranged, a contradiction the castle could neither correct nor conceal. He stood taller than his peers, but never fully upright, as though some invisible weight pulled his shoulders back, kept his stance quiet. His tutors said he was gifted but difficult, intuitive but prone to melancholy, courteous but impatient. He learned quickly but resisted rote. He could recite the laws of succession, but questioned their logic. He could ride with grace and shoot with accuracy, yet return from hunts with eyes darkened by thought rather than triumph. The Baron's wife, his adoptive mother, claimed he had always been sensitive. The Baron himself rarely spoke to him in public and watched him in private with a quiet, unreadable scrutiny. No one mentioned the Baroness who had died the night he was born. Her portrait hung in the northern corridor, above the stairs, her gaze distant, her hands folded over a painted garden. Some said he resembled her. Others said nothing. But it was not her features that echoed in his face. It was something else, something older, something unaccounted for. The castle knew it. So did the servants, who had stopped trying to predict his moods and instead left him be, allowing him to wander ground alone, to spend hours in the old archives, to speak to no one for days, and then suddenly erupt into questions no one could answer. He asked about birth records, about estate midwives, about the names of those who had served the house 20 years before. The steward replied with practiced evasions. The records had been lost. The midwife had died. The ledgers had been damaged in the fire that swept through the scriptorium a decade ago. Lyran did not believe them, not because they were unconvincing, but because he felt something deep and persistent inside him, a hum beneath the surface of thought, a quiet insistence that what he had been told was not what had been lived. It began, as many changes do, in small, disobedient acts. He started refusing to bow, not out of arrogance, but out of principle. When introduced at court, he would lift his chin slightly higher, his posture neither challenging nor deferential, as though the rituals of hierarchy no longer held meaning for him. He questioned the chapel priest about bloodlines, about adoption rights, about the difference between legitimacy and truth. He wrote letters he never sent and hid them in the hollow of a tree that grew at the edge of the northern woods. He began to rise before dawn and sit in the observatory, not to chart the stars but to watch the horizon, as though expecting someone to come walking from the hills. He asked the cook if he remembered the old handmaid who had worked for the Baroness's sister. The cook frowned and said that woman had left before the child was born. But Lyran saw something shift in his eyes, a flicker of discomfort, and he knew. He did not confront them. Not yet, but he withdrew. Each day, he pulled a little further from the role he had been raised to wear like a well-fitted coat. He took no pleasure in the velvet tunics they tailored for him. He declined to dine with the court guests. He stopped attending lessons he deemed irrelevant. He took instead to writing, at first in the margins of his old school books, then on pages he bound himself. His script was sharp and angular, more pressure than elegance, but it filled a page like confession. He wrote about identity, about silence, about the friction between inheritance and belonging. And one morning, with trembling fingers, he wrote a name. He did not know where it had come from. It had never been spoken to him, never written down, but it was in him. Alira. The memory of her was not exact. He did not remember her face clearly, but he remembered the feeling, the warmth of arms that held not out of duty, but out of instinct, the sound of a voice that sang not to soothe, but to remember. He had dreamt of her many times as a child, a woman with dark hair and eyes like still water, a voice that said his name before he knew it, a grief that poured into him like milk into a cup. The dreams had faded as he grew, but the feeling had not. And now, at 17, with the world folding itself around him in lies dressed as lineage, he could no longer pretend the feeling was just a child's illusion. It was truth, and he would find it. He began to press harder. He demanded access to the estate records. The private archives kept locked in the Tower Library. The steward refused, citing protocol. Lyran sent a message to the Baron's study requesting a formal audience. He waited 3 days for a reply. When none came, he entered the study uninvited. The Baron was seated by the hearth, reading correspondence. He looked up slowly. "I want the truth," Lyran said. The Baron did not blink. "You've had the truth your whole life." Lyran stepped forward. Not the polished one. Not the one handed to me in scrolls and prayers. The real one, who was my mother. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of all the things that had never been said, all the choices that had paved over pain with duty, all the nights when a crying infant had been taken into a cold nursery and named without question. The Baron looked at him then, not with anger, but with something deeper. Regret, perhaps, or fear, or simply the weight of inevitability. "You are Ashvale now," he said. "That is what matters." Lyran stepped back. He saw then that there would be no revelation from this man. No confession, only denial dressed as kindness. But he had already begun to outgrow the shape they had carved for him, and there was someone who would tell him the truth. He knew it now. The letter he had written weeks ago, folded into plain paper and given to a traveler in exchange for silence, had not been a question. It had been a signal. He left the castle the next morning, not in defiance. In clarity, he wore simple clothes, took no escort, and rode a gray mare he had broken himself the year before. He rode west, past a river bend, through pine groves and silent meadows, across the low hills that whispered of stories long buried. The journey took 2 days. He slept in barns and under trees, ate dried fruit and well water, and did not once speak aloud. When he reached the cloister of quiet reeds, the lake greeted him in stillness. The reeds did not move. The silence was complete. He tethered his horse at the outer post and walked to the gate. It was open. No guards. No summons. He passed through and found himself in a garden of balm and heather, where a woman knelt in the soil, her hands deep in the earth. She looked up slowly. He knew her, not by face, by presence. Alira rose. She did not speak. Neither did he. They stood for a moment, two figures bound by something that had refused to dissolve, even after all the years, the fires, the stolen names. Then she stepped forward, slowly, and placed a hand on his cheek. He closed his eyes. "I remember," he said, and she smiled, faint and hollow, but real. Then she whispered his name, the real one, the one she had given him when he first opened his eyes in that manor room thick with death and lies. Lyren. No title, no crest, just a name passed from truth to breath. She led him to a bench by the water. There, she handed him the folded page of the ledger, its ink worn but legible. She said nothing. She did not need to. He read it. His fingers trembled. When he reached the name Lita Thorne, he paused. She was no one to them, Alira said softly, but she was someone to you. Lyren nodded. Then I will be someone for her. And in that moment, Alira saw not the boy she had once held, not the exile she had become, but the beginning of a new story, one where blood was not just burden, but bond, where the truth was not hidden in ashes, but carried into light. The wind moved across the reeds at last, and the stillness became song. The road of returning names is not paved in triumph. It is not lined with lanterns or hymns. It is narrow, uneven, often cold, edged by memory and the quiet ache of things unspoken. It is a path that does not wind toward recognition, but circles back toward self again and again until what once was burden becomes a kind of belonging. Lyren walked this road now, no longer under cloak or crest, no longer shielded by title or distance. He rode out from the lake of quiet reeds with nothing but the name he had chosen to reclaim, the truth written into the parchment folded inside his coat, and the echo of her voice still pressed against the inside of his chest. Alira had not tried to change his mind. She had not warned him of the weight he would carry. She had only handed him the last page of the midwife's ledger, wrapped in lavender sprigs and soft linen, and told him that once a truth is carried, it must be carried through. That legacy is not given. It is chosen, and choice, he now understood, was the deepest kind of inheritance. The hills between the cloister and Milford had grown green again, dense with thistle and foxglove, the soil damp with the promise of summer storms. The land had changed since Alira had last passed through it, and even now as Lyren traced the path she once fled in terror, the landscape held a different breath, less cruel perhaps, but not yet kind. The village itself had grown wider but not wealthier. New roofs had replaced old ones, but the walls were the same, stained with time, patched with quiet. It was a place still shaped by caution, by stories half told around hearths, by a long history of what could not be named. Children played in the square, barefoot and quick-eyed, and women carried baskets with their heads down, watching the road from the corners of their gaze. When Lyren dismounted at the edge of the green, no one spoke to him, but he was seen. That much he felt, as if the earth itself remembered him, not as a man but as a child who had been carried to the fields on a moonlit night, wrapped in lies and silence. He did not go first to the manor. That house no longer held anything he wished to claim. Instead, He walked the length of the village until he came to the house at the end of the lane, the midwife's cottage, shuttered and vine-covered, its front step worn smooth by years of absence. The door creaked as he opened it, not locked but bowed with age, and the air inside was thick with dust and lavender and the weight of memory. It was there she first seen him, he knew. His eyes still slick with birth, his body still wrapped in warmth and danger. It was there she had hidden the ledger, where she had dared to return alone, to find proof that no one else had wanted to see. He stepped across the threshold and paused, letting the space settle around him. He did not speak. The walls did not echo. But something in the floorboards, the way they sighed beneath his boots, told him that her presence still lived here, not in form but in faith. The unwavering faith of one woman who had risked everything to carry a truth she could not forget. He spent the night in the cottage, lighting a small fire on the hearth with kindling from the garden, eating dry bread for his pack, sleeping wrapped in his cloak on the old cot that still smelled faintly of soot and dried herbs. He dreamed of water, not the lake but a river, rushing and clear, its surface scattered with names etched in stone, bobbing like lily pads. He reached for one, and it crumbled in his hand, revealing another beneath it, his own. He woke at dawn with the name Lita on his lips. The morning of his return to the manor was overcast, the sky smeared with clouds the color of linen soaked in ash. He rode slowly, not because he doubted, but because he understood the magnitude of arrival. The manor rose out of the hills as it always had, stately and subdued, its stone face unchanged, its windows blind. The guards at the gate recognized him, but did not stop him. They moved aside without speaking, eyes lowered, and he passed between them not as a son, but as something else entirely. Something they could not name, but would no longer deny. Inside, the halls echoed with silence. Servants paused at the sight of him, but did not speak. The steward, old and thinner now, met him at the base of the great stair and bowed, the gesture too late to carry meaning. "He's in the west chamber," he said quietly. He asked not to be disturbed. Lyra nodded and walked past him. The west chamber had once been a study, but had been converted into the Baron's personal quarters after an illness robbed him of the strength to climb stairs. Lyra knocked once. Then he entered. The room smelled of paper and age. The Baron sat by the window, his back bent slightly, a thick wool blanket across his knees. He did not turn when Lyra entered, only said, "I wonder when you come." "I came because it's time," Lyra replied. A long pause followed. Then the Baron asked, "What do you want?" "Not power, not inheritance," Lyra said. "Just the truth, and a name." The Baron turned then. His face was more lined than Lyra remembered, his eyes clouded but not blind. He looked at the young man before him, as if seeing something inevitable. "It will change nothing," he said. "It already has," Lyra replied, and placed a folded page on the table between them. The Baron reached for it slowly, his hands trembling not with fear, but with age. He read in silence. When he finished, he did not tear the page or deny its ink. He simply folded it again and placed it beside him. "And what will you do with it?" Lyra looked at him then, with a calm that came not from defiance but from deep, quiet understanding. "I will tell it. I will let it live in the open, so it can no longer be used to bury others." The Baron nodded once, as though conceding not defeat, but release. "She loved you, you know," he said, voice softer now. "The one who bore you. Lita, she sang to you before they took her away." Lyra closed his eyes. "Then I will carry her voice." He left without further words. The halls seemed quieter now, not because they had changed, but because he no longer sought belonging in them. Outside, the air had shifted. The clouds had begun to break. In the village square, people watched him pass, some whispering, some silent. He did not ride with arrogance. He walked among them, and at the chapel steps, he climbed to the pulpit and stood beneath the old bell that had not rung since the fire that took the eastern quarter. He did not speak loudly, but every word reached. "I am not the son of title," he said. "I am the son of a woman who was erased. I am the child of truth that would not sleep. I have returned not to claim land, but to give name. The name of Lita Thorne, my mother, the woman who bore me and was buried in silence. Let her be forgotten no longer. No one applauded. No one cried out, but heads bowed, and silence, once a weapon, became witness. That night, he returned to the cottage at the edge of the village. There, in the quiet, he lit a candle and placed a ledger page beside it. He did not burn it. He copied again, this time in his own hand, and placed that copy in the chapel's book of parish records between the births and deaths of that year. He signed it simply, Lyra Thorne, and Way returned once more to the lake. Alira was waiting in the garden, her hands in the soil. He sat beside her, without a word. She reached over and took his hand, and they watched as names long buried began to bloom again. The trial was not held in a hall of marble and cresting stone, but in the long shadow of the chapel that had once served as the center of Milford's rhythm. Births and deaths, weddings and warnings, prayers muttered between fields and fevers. Time had cracked the bell tower. Moss crept into the spaces where stained glass had once colored the floor with light, and the pews bore deep grooves from generations of restless hands. Yet it stood, and in its bones the village gathered, not by decree, not by threat, but by something deeper. Curiosity, perhaps, or memory, or the pull of a story that refused to stay buried. The council, what remained of it, took their seats at the long table draped in white linen. The linen had once been reserved for sacraments. Now it served to give the illusion of order. The 3 candles were placed before them, unlit at first. Their wax was uneven, drawn from 3 different homes, 3 different hearths, shaped by 3 different hands. One was thick and ivory, slightly melted at the base. One narrow, dipped in ash-gray wax, the last short and squat, the color of old snow. Alira noticed this as she entered, her step steady but without haste. She wore no veil, no cloak, only a plain shift of soft linen, her hair bound back with a single thread of red, the same thread her mother had once wrapped around her wrist in a quiet kitchen long ago. She carried no satchel, no locket, no ledger, nothing but herself, and that at last was enough. Lyra stood beside her, taller now, his shoulders filled out, his face solemn. His presence was not announced. It was simply known. The crowd shifted as he passed, the hush deepening into something more than silence. Recognition was a slow thing in a place like Milford. It came not in cries, but in stillness. There were those who had whispered of his eyes since he was a boy. Those who had seen the way his face did not echo the family portraits that lined the manor walls. Those who had wondered, but never allowed, why the midwife's apprentice had vanished the night he was born. Now, all those threads have found their knot. The eldest of the council, a man called Harith, who had once been a carpenter and then a magistrate, rose and cleared his throat. "This gathering," he said, "has been called to reckon with a history unspoken." His voice was not strong, but it carried. There are claims of deception, of false lineage, of an exile wrongly cast. The council has agreed to hear testimony, to witness, to listen. The word listen hung in the air like a bell not yet struck. Lyra stepped forward first. He did not read from parchment. He did not offer dramatic gestures. He spoke plainly, like one walking a tightrope he had already crossed in dreams. He spoke of his childhood, the questions that were never answered, the records that were sealed or missing, the sense of fracture that had followed him like a breath behind every celebration. He spoke of the night he left the manor, the road he took, the letter he wrote to the cloister, the voice he found beside the lake. He spoke of Alira, not as a servant or exile, but as the first person who had ever given him truth without armor. He unfolded the copied ledger page and placed it before the council. "This is not forgery," he said. "It was hidden, but not by her." He gestured to Alira. "She found it, risked her life for it, carried it in silence while the rest of you forgot the name of the girl who gave me breath. That name was Lita Thorne. She was not noble, but she was kind. She was young, and she was silenced before I ever knew her." A murmur stirred the gathered crowd, but no one interrupted. Lyra paused, his jaw tight, then continued. "I do not ask for titles. I do not reject the house that raised me, but I ask you to remember what was taken. From her, from Alira, from me, not out of vengeance, but out of truth. I am not ashamed of my blood. I choose to bear it. He stepped back. Alira exhaled. Then she stepped forward. Her voice, when it came, was not the voice of a girl who had fled or a woman who had hidden. It was a voice that had sung lullabies and burned cottages and taught forgotten girls to read by candlelight. It was a voice that had said nothing for too long and now chose to speak. She told the story, not the one the village had whispered and reshaped, but the one that lived in her chest like a wound that had never closed. She told of the night of the red moon, of the birth, of the eyes that opened and saw through her. She told of the moment she realized the Baroness had not carried the child, that the handmaid had, that the names had been exchanged, the truth overwritten in haste and desperation. She told how the baby was taken from her arms, how she was called mad, how the cold banishment had carved her into something unrecognizable. She spoke not with anger, but with a reverence for every silence she had survived. She named the places she had gone, the people she had loved and lost. She named Marla. She named Lita. She named herself. When she finished, she stepped aside. The council was still. The crowd behind them had grown. People stood in the chapel doorways, on the steps, in the courtyard, craning to hear a truth that had outlived the fire built to bury it. Harith leaned forward. Do you bring evidence? Alira looked at the candles. Yes, she said. I bring memory. And one by one, she lit them, the first, for the mother who bore the weight of another's mistake, and died without her name carved into any stone. The flame flickered tall. The second, for the mother who risked her life to carry a truth through exile, who held a child as her own even after he was taken. The flame burned steady. The third, for the mother who dared to speak when the world demanded her silence. The flame did not waver. The council said nothing for a long time. Then a woman from the back stepped forward. She was older, with hair white as thistledown, and she did not ask permission to speak. I remember Lita, she said. She came to me once, crying in the fields. She was frightened. She said something terrible had happened. I thought she meant war or sickness. I gave her bread. I told her to rest. I never saw her again, and I never spoke her name, not even when I saw the child's eyes in the cradle, and knew they weren't the Baron's. Her voice cracked. I should have spoken. Another stepped forward, and another, a chambermaid, a baker, a shepherd's widow. One by one, the town began to return the pieces of the story Alira had kept safe, not because she demanded it, but because truth, once offered light, finds its way through the roots of things. By dusk, the chapel was thick with memory, not accusation. Names once whispered were spoken aloud, and in the space between testimony and verdict, the council stood again. There will be no punishment, Harith said, because none is deserved. He looked at Alira. There will be no pardon, because there is nothing to forgive. He turned to Lyran. Your name, by law, is Ashvale, but what name do you choose? Lyran stepped forward, his voice clear. I choose both. I am Lyran Ashvale, son of Lita Thorn. He paused. And I will not let her name die. A silence followed. Then, from the pews, someone stood and began to hum. Not a hymn, but something older, a lullaby. Others joined. The sound grew soft but insistent. Alira closed her eyes. She knew that tune. She had sung it once, in a burning town, to a child with silver eyes. The candles flickered, and the trial ended not in sentence, but in song. The reed flowers bloomed low that spring, their violet petals curling close to the damp earth as if still mourning the frost that had nearly buried them. The lake of quiet reeds no longer stood still. It breathed now, with a slow and living rhythm, a pulse made visible in the way its surface quivered under wind and light. The cloister remained quiet, but it was no longer quiet of fear or retreat. It had become something else entirely, a listening place, a soil where truth could settle and root. The sisters continued their work with the same steady hands, but their songs had changed. They hummed as they mixed tinctures and washed linens, a little louder now, their voices tracing melodies once reserved for dusk and solitude. The chapel was open more often. The library had grown by 3 shelves, And in the garden where balm grew thick and bees moved lazily from bloom to bloom, a new grave had been marked. Elira had returned to the cloister not with triumph or ceremony, but with the same steady tread that had carried her from flame to snow, from exile to return. She no longer avoided the eyes of the girls she taught. She met their gazes squarely, spoke their names with clarity, and asked them questions that made them pause and think. She still kept to her old room, now slightly expanded with a second shelf and a new cot placed near the window, but she was no longer hidden. Each morning, she walked the perimeter of the cloister, pressing her palm to the stone gate before entering the gardens, as if reminding herself that the world beyond still existed, still spun its threads of cruelty and beauty, but that within these walls there was breath and belonging and a kind of light that did not burn. When Lyren visited, which he did more often now, he came alone. He brought no retinue, no titles, no banners sewn with crest or emblem. He carried letters, sometimes books, more often questions. He arrived on foot when the weather allowed, and on horseback when the rains made the road slick and treacherous. Each time, the sisters nodded in quiet recognition, their expressions unreadable but warm. He never stayed long. 2 nights, 3 at most, but during those visits, something in the air softened. The reeds seemed to part more easily. The water cleared. The younger girls whispered stories about the boy with the silver eyes who walked the gardens like he had once belonged to the wind. They asked if he would stay, if he would build a house near the lake. Elira never answered those questions, not because she did not know, but because she believed in the sacredness of movement. The world needed Lyren to keep walking. Still, he returned again and again, as though drawn not by the lake, but by the steadiness of the woman who had once risked her life to save his name. On his 4th visit, he brought a box carved from ashwood, its hinges delicate and smooth. Inside, wrapped in a silk cloth, lay the original page from a midwife's ledger. The ink faded, the corners browned, the name still clear. He had preserved it, framed it between glass and wood, and beneath the names he had written in his own hand a 4th line. Lyren Thorne remembered. They hung it in the cloister's small hall of records, not in the chapel, not in the archive, but beside the garden doors, where those passing from labor to rest might pause and read it. There was no plaque, no explanation, just the names, the ink, the silence. Elira touched it once each morning, her fingers lingering a moment longer on Lita's name. She did not weep. Her grief had changed shape over the years. It no longer pulled her down. It sat beside her now, quiet and loyal, a companion rather than a wound. The girls she had taught grew into young women. Some stayed, choosing the cloister's rhythm of care and learning. Others left, bearing skills that would root themselves in other villages, other kitchens, other battle-worn parishes. One wrote letters back with questions about childbirth complications. Another sent a pressed wildflower with a note thanking Elira for teaching her that her body was not shameful. Their words were folded into the cloister's prayer book, not as scripture, but as witness. Memory had become legacy, and legacy was now passed hand to hand, not sealed in vaults. Elira's hair had begun to gray. The lines around her eyes deepened, not with sorrow, but with the quiet knowledge of having seen too much and survived it without bitterness. She moved more slowly in the garden now, favoring her left knee, but her hands were still sure, her voice still low and even. She laughed more often, not loudly, but sincerely, the kind of laugh that came from knowing one had already walked through fire and frost, and still chosen to keep living with her palms open, not clenched. It was a warm day in early spring when she fell ill. There was no warning, no wound or fever, just a quiet weakening, a slowing of her steps, a loss of appetite she brushed off with soft excuses. She still worked, but only in the mornings. She still taught, but seated, the girls gathered close around her. One afternoon, she fainted in the orchard, and from that moment the sisters did not let her walk unaccompanied. She did not resist their care. She accepted it with the grace of someone who had once been alone and would never be again. When word reached Lyren, he came without hesitation. He arrived during a windless dawn, the air thick with bird call, the sky pale with the first blush of sun. He did not knock. He walked the cloister halls with familiarity, passing the herb room, the prayer shelves, the basin where the girls washed their hands after lessons. He found her in her room, propped upright with cushions, her hair unbound for the first time in years. She smiled when she saw him, and he took her hand without speaking. "I'm not afraid," she said after a long silence. "I know," he answered, "but I wish you didn't have to go." "We all do," she said, "until it's time." He stayed by her side for 3 days. On the third night, she asked him to light a candle. He did. Then another. Then a third. "For the mother who bore me," she said. "For the mother who raised you," he added. "And for the child who became something more," she finished. She passed in the early hours, her breath slowing like a tide retreating. There was no pain. Her hands remained warm until sunrise. The cloister buried her at the edge of the garden, beneath the reed flowers, where the bees still came and the wind moved in gentle spirals. The sisters placed stones, not engraved, but worn smooth by years of lake water. Each bore a single word etched by hand. One said truth. One said keeper. The last, placed by Lyran, said home. He did not speak at the burial. He sat with her locket in his palm and watched the soil close over the body of the woman who had carried his name through fire and silence. That night, he sat beside the lake until dawn, his boots wet with dew, his eyes open to the shifting surface of the water. He returned to the cloister every spring after that, bringing flowers, books, sometimes a child by the hand, his own in time. He showed them the garden. He told them of a woman who had lived in truth when the world demanded silence. He read them the names from the ledger. He taught them that truth was not something discovered, but something remembered. The cloister changed, slowly, as all living things do. New sisters came. The chapel was repaired. A small library was built beside the orchard, named not for saints or kings, but for Elira. They called it the house of the returning name. And in it hung the page she had carried for decades, the name still legible, the ink faded but not forgotten. Lyran never took a title. He never returned to the manor. He became, instead, a keeper of small things, stories, seeds, songs his mother had never gotten a chance to sing. And when he grew old, he was buried beside the garden too, where the lake could see him and the wind could speak his name. Together, they remained mother and son, truth and memory, seed and bloom. And long after their names had stopped being spoken in courts or chronicles, they lived still in the hands of those who dared to remember. In silence, they had been cast out, but in remembering they were home.